Hello, Star Wars fans. I hope all of you had a wonderful Christmas and a Happy New Year's. But now it's time to talk Star Wars. A couple months ago, I made a video covering how Disney Star Wars is not modern myth. I talked about how myths used to be told in oral verse, and how there was a necessity to tell the stories in such a way that the audience would not feel compelled to interrupt the storyteller to ask questions. And I talked about how Disney Star Wars failed in this regard by adding gags, unnecessary scenes, and ruining continuity. There are so many scenes in Disney's version of Star Wars that don't contain story, that undermine Star Wars as a whole, and which undermine the main characters, all of which take people out of the movie and break immersion. But now I would like to talk about myth in a different way, in how myth serves as the basis of identity for communities, tribes, and nations, and how Disney Star Wars was an attempt to override the identity of Star Wars fans. I've recently read through a book titled Parallel Myths by J.F. Bierlin, which, if I had to sum up the book's essentially about how every culture throughout history has had similar stories in which to convey proper moral conduct, meaning that what makes a good person is similar throughout all cultures. Now take the original trilogy. It is referred to as a modern version of the hero's journey. Now you might ask, what is the message that a hero's journey is supposed to convey? It's supposed to inspire you to live as a hero, basically to give life meaning, and to be a rough guide on how human life is to be lived. A hero's journey is basically a blueprint on how to be a good person and how to make the right choices. And there are multiple steps throughout the journey. There are plenty of breakdowns of the hero's journey, Joseph Campbell's 12 Stages of a Hero's Journey being the most well known. But I prefer a shorter version. The hero will go on a journey outside his comfort zone, grow from overcoming life's challenges. The hero will learn skills, social or otherwise, from allies, and using everything they've learned to better society and to pass their knowledge along at the end. Now, let's look at the original trilogy with these steps in mind. Luke goes off into space on an adventure, deals with a variety of challenges and villains, and makes plenty of friends and allies along the way. But the original trilogy never shows the final step of this list or of Joseph Campbell's final 12th stage, which is why the sequel trilogy by Disney is so offensive to Star Wars fans. Disney claims the sequel trilogy to be a continuation of the Skywalker saga, yet they basically try to start the story over again with new heroes. And what's even worse is how badly they failed. They failed because they tried to subvert the message of Star Wars. Instead of a hero's journey, we are getting a face full of feminist propaganda. Remember how earlier I mentioned how the original trilogy is considered a modern version of the hero's journey? And that a hero's journey is a blueprint on how to be a good person and how to make right choices? Disney, however, essentially tried to alter the blueprint of what makes a good person. In the words of Mythbusters, Disney tried to
reject your reality and substitute my own.
But the thing is, a hero's journey is ingrained into the mindset of most Star Wars fans from the original trilogy, which is why Disney Star Wars is facing such a strong rejection from the established Star Wars fan base. Disney is trying to subvert what it means to be a hero, and a hero is supposed to be an inspiration, to be a guiding light to how a person should live. Yet the message of Disney Star Wars is that your heroic potential or goodness potential is determined by your race, gender, sexual preference, and how well you listen to women no matter the situation, which is concerning because they are targeting children with their movies that are filled with feminist ideology. I've made a video on the topic already, and I'll put a link down below so you can check it out later. Now you might be asking yourself, how can you believe my claim that the original trilogy was modern myth? After all, I'm basing my whole video on the topic. So here's a short clip from the documentary Star Wars: The Legacy Revealed, where I plant my flag.
Star Wars evolved into a 6-chapter cinematic saga, one that resonates with some of the most enduring themes found in literature, mythology, religion, and history.
What Star Wars did was bring them right up to date and reach a new generation.
It broke new ground in terms of communicating a message.
Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi.
I was witnessing the creation of modern myth.
Here's another clip.
The connection between Star Wars and mythology is also strengthened by the direct influence of famed mythological historian Joseph Campbell.
Joseph Campbell was a professor, and he wrote a very important book about myth. And this book was used on college campuses across the country. And this was a book that George Lucas read. In it, Joseph Campbell said, "Myth is a metaphor for the experience of life."
Myths and dreams come from the same place. They come from realizations of some kind that have then to find expression in symbolic form.
Here's another clip of the same documentary, which talks about how George Lucas's Star Wars films make use of the hero's journey.
And in the Star Wars films, George Lucas has made a very compelling use of one of the myth forms, which is the hero's journey. And this is by far the most commonly found form in the history of mythology.
I would actually suggest you all to watch the documentary in its entirety as well, just so you can once again appreciate the universe George Lucas created. All cultures have similar morals, such as killing is bad, don't steal, etc. And we already covered how myths are the source of moral conduct. So for George Lucas's Star Wars to be called modern myth is not merely empty praise. They help reaffirm good versus evil. This is the core of Star Wars that Sir Alec Guinness correctly identified when he read the script.
And I asked him why he wanted to do it, and he loved the idea of playing a mentor or wizard in a morality play where good and evil so clearly defined.
Now, if Disney had done a proper sequel trilogy to cap off the Skywalker saga, it would have gone over the final step of the hero's journey. Something like the Odyssey, an ancient Greek epic poem which capped off the story of Odysseus after the events of the Iliad. In the discontinued expanded universe of Star Wars, Luke Skywalker starts a new Jedi Academy where he mentors new students, marries a redhead, and has a son who he names Ben in honor of Obi-Wan Kenobi, all while still facing new challenges. These types of events might have been a wonderful way to accomplish the final step of Luke Skywalker's heroic journey. Yet Disney didn't want to pull this off. It would not be a fit vehicle to cram feminist and racist ideology upon the viewers. I say it's full of feminist ideology because they believe a male actor can't inspire women. And I say it's racist because they believe a black person can only be inspired by a black actor, a Chinese person can only be inspired by an Asian actor, and a white actor is only inspirational to white people. They want their audience to have a wedge driven among them through race and gender. Yet a myth is supposed to be something to bring communities, tribes, and nations together. So the wedge that Disney is using to divide the fan base is further proof that Disney's sequel trilogy is not modern myth, alongside the fact that it's full of unnecessary scenes that create so many questions that pull the audience out of the story. Yet the original trilogy transcended all of that. Check out some of these clips from the Empire of Dreams Star Wars documentary.
People started seeing the world in the terms that Star Wars had laid down. People would say, "May the Force be with you." It was a kind of code almost. It proved that you were one of the people who had seen the film and you were connecting with other people who had seen the film. Star Wars became like a kind of handshake.
The cultural impact of Lucas's outer space story was greater than anything even he could have imagined, not just in the United States, but around the globe.
It wasn't a story of cultures, it wasn't a story of nationalities, it wasn't a story of geography. It was a story of mankind escaping his environment to a life which everybody expects to happen, but George Lucas was able to illustrate for us. This was what made it a success worldwide.
Because a hero's story is common to all cultures, it is the main reason Star Wars was so profitable. Everyone from everywhere wanted to be like Luke, be able to make the same choices as Luke, and to live their life like Luke, to be a good person who could stand up to evil. and the futuristic science fiction setting is what made it even more appealing across the world. Technology is advancing at a rapid pace, so a hero story based around futuristic technology resonates with nearly every person on Earth who has the means to watch one of George Lucas's Star Wars movies. Yet the same is not true of Disney's Star Wars. It does not resonate with other cultures around the world. Take China, for example. The original trilogy's ticket sales in China were not really recorded, but the prequel's ticket sales were. And each prequel movie made more than the last. The story resonated for the Chinese audience. China is no different from the rest of the world when you realize they also have hero stories. Now look at the ticket sales of each Disney Star Wars movie that released in China. Each movie made less than the preceding movie. The Chinese audience wants nothing to do with Disney Star Wars. And why is that? Because they recognize it as something termed baizo, a term defined as referring to those who are hypocritically obsessed with political correctness in order to satisfy their own feeling of moral superiority, motivated from an ignorant and arrogant Western-centric worldview, who pity the rest of the world and think they are saviors. It's basically virtue signaling. They don't recognize Disney Star Wars as a hero's journey, which means they don't recognize Disney Star Wars as Star Wars. To them, it is baizo propaganda which insults their IQ. I would have to agree with them. But now you might be saying, wait a minute. The prequels are bad movies too. And you wouldn't be wrong. The prequels have bad pacing. Take this scene, for example.
There is no civility, only politics. The Republic is not what it once was. The Senate is full of greedy, squabbling delegates.
There is no interest in the common good.
I must be frank, Your Majesty. There is little chance the Senate will act on the invasion.
Chancellor Valorum seems to think there is hope.
If I may say so, Your Majesty, the Chancellor has little real power. He is mired by baseless accusations of corruption. The bureaucrats are in charge now.
What options have we?
Our best choice would be to push for the election of a stronger Supreme Chancellor, one who could control the bureaucrats and give us justice. You could call for a vote of no confidence in Chancellor Valorum.
He has been our strongest supporter.
Our only other choice would be to submit a plea to the courts.
The courts take even longer to decide things than the Senate. Our people are dying, Senator. We must do something quickly to stop the Federation.
To be realistic, Your Majesty, I think we're going to have to accept Federation control for the time being.
That is something I cannot do.
It's really long. But that scene could have been trimmed down to just this.
I must be frank, Your Majesty. There is little chance the Senate will act on the invasion.
Chancellor Valorum seems to think there is hope.
If I may say so, Your Majesty, the Chancellor has little real power.
What options have we?
Our best choice would be to push for the election of a stronger Supreme Chancellor, one who could control the bureaucrats and give us justice. You could call for a vote of no confidence in Chancellor Valorum.
He has been our strongest supporter.
Our only other choice would be to submit a plea to the courts.
The courts take even longer to decide things than the Senate. We must do something quickly to stop the Federation.
To be realistic, Your Majesty, I think we're going to have to accept Federation control for the time being.
That is something I cannot do.
I was able to remove 31% of the original scene and still convey the story relevant to the main plotline, from 85 seconds down to 58 seconds. That's an example of what I mean when I say that the prequels have bad pacing. The prequels also have cheesy dialogue and one hateable character, but despite all those problems, the prequels still felt like Star Wars, because they still incorporated a hero's journey with elements of good versus evil. The prequel trilogy's main crime was just not being as finely crafted as the original trilogy. The original trilogy set the bar just that high. Sir Alec Guinness helped George with the dialogue.
George Lucas phoned me and said, you know, very grateful for the little alterations you suggested, and so we'd like to offer you another 0.5%.
And his wife at the time, Marcia Lucas, was one of the best editors in Hollywood. I suggest watching How Star Wars Was Saved in the Edit to understand how important her role in editing Star Wars was. And by the time George Lucas started work on the prequels, Sir Alec Guinness was tired of Star Wars fans, and George had long gotten divorced from Marcia, which meant that he had no trusted peers or mentors at the same level as before who thought they could help advise the super successful George Lucas during the making of the prequels. Or if they did try to advise him, he didn't listen. But despite the prequels not being as good as the original trilogy, it still felt like Star Wars. Each scene conveyed story, and the good versus evil theme that all cultures understand was still being told. Except this time we got to see someone making the bad choices. Remember, cultures have parallel myths. And as long as the message conveys the same morals, they can resonate with any culture in the world. Instead, Disney Star Wars has created an ambiguous, morally gray mess. You don't know whether the hero is Rey or Kylo. None of the characters in the new movies are useful role models because they can do anything and everything already. Can any of you listening honestly tell me that you can overcome any challenge without any training? The new characters can. That's why the new characters suck. They skipped the final step of Luke Skywalker's saga in an attempt to start over with new heroes, while telling Star Wars fans it was continuing the Skywalker saga. It's insulting. The Chinese were right. It insults our IQ. Disney Star Wars is not modern myth. Disney tried to distort Star Wars, which is why the majority of Star Wars fans are rejecting the new movies. And Disney doesn't care about the old fans. They don't care about us, because they are trying to imprint their Hollyweird identity upon children. Disney wants children to think a combination of gender, skin color, and sexual preferences is what determines someone's identity as a good person. But even kids know that isn't fair. Living your life as a hero and having your actions determine your worth is fair. Movies that can convey a message where your actions determine your worth are inspirational, to the point where documentaries about the movie franchise classify George Lucas's movies as modern myth. A franchise worthy of becoming the biggest movie franchise in history before landing in Disney's hands. Let me take a little tangent here. I would say that the MCU is now the biggest movie franchise. And guess what? Some of the characters' arcs throughout the MCU are starting to resemble that of a hero's journey. That is why they are the biggest movies and they are resonating around the world. At the very start, each individual superhero movie was fun entertainment, but now the MCU as a whole has evolved into modern myth as well. Take a look at Tony Stark's Iron Man. He is on the last step of the hero's journey, where he is now bettering society and mentoring others. He has taken Peter Parker under his wing. He has been helping the young superhero and sharing his own knowledge with the impressionable youth. And Iron Man is the most iconic and beloved superhero out of a whole cast of superheroes. However, the MCU looks to be casting aside everything they've built up to push SJW propaganda in 2019 with Captain Marvel. Expect the MCU to face fan backlash similar to how Star Wars fans reacted after The Last Jedi. I think the MCU in the future is going to lose its title as the biggest movie franchise as soon as they start pushing an SJW agenda. Because the MCU looks to be abandoning the formula that makes them relatable to the rest of the world. But back to Star Wars. So yeah, in my honest opinion, the very core of Star Wars is in the life lessons of the hero's journey. A type of myth that inspires people to live a heroic, good life. George Lucas's Star Wars taught children that their actions determined whether or not they are good people. Yet Disney, Kathleen Kennedy's, and Lucasfilm's version of Star Wars do not, which is why Disney Star Wars does not feel like Star Wars. It is inherently flawed since they mishandled the brand. And I think it was on purpose, a franchise purchase to push an agenda. Yet Star Wars fans can tell that Disney Star Wars movies are not real Star Wars movies. We aren't buying the new message now, since the initial hype wave for new Star Wars movies has died down. And despite modern media claiming that The Last Jedi backlash is comparable to how audiences viewed Empire Strikes Back, nothing can change the fact that the message contained is different between George Lucas's vision and Kathleen Kennedy's vision for Star Wars. The Last Jedi will not be viewed more favorably as time moves on, because its message has not and will not endure the changing of cultures. But despite the current toxic SJW political climate of today, cultures in the long run will always value a good person for their own deeds, and not the uncontrollable aspects of their birth. You should never feel guilty about disliking Disney Star Wars, no matter what the modern media says, because the message in Disney Star Wars is both racist and sexist. That gut-wrenching, pissed-off feeling you get from watching The Last Jedi, that is the recognition that the film is trying to pass on values that you can't accept. And the aversion children have to the film, that is because children are not stupid. They can tell there is something odd there that doesn't mesh well with what they've experienced with their developing brains from normal society. Why do you think Star Wars toys aren't selling? Kids are put off by Disney Star Wars movies. Disney Star Wars movies are not normal, and Hollyweird won't become the new normal. The main characters of Disney Star Wars movies are not heroes, because their choices and actions don't resonate with how every single culture to date has defined a good person. No matter how modern media is currently trying to control that narrative on what makes a good person. So now that you've heard me repeatedly say that the message being conveyed in Disney Star Wars is the reason why their movies don't feel like George Lucas's trilogies, let me take an extremely brief moment to point an angry finger at the reason why. The root of all problems in Disney Star Wars is Kathleen Kennedy. Kathleen Kennedy is why Disney Star Wars is now SJW propaganda instead of decent films. Her employee hirings, her director firings, and ideology are all centered around her being a feminist. I guess I'll now try to sum up what I've said throughout this entire video. Cultures throughout the world and history have had these myth-like stories to pass along good values. And the actions of those characters in those myths tend to make similar moral choices, to the point that the lesson to be learned is parallel to the stories of other cultures. And George Lucas's Star Wars contained some of those same lessons, except his story utilized futuristic technology instead of gods and magic. It's what made it modern. And the fact that the cultures of today are all dealing with rapidly improving technology was what made Star Wars so appealing to all of them. Because Star Wars was a good versus evil myth that was relatable to everyone excited for new scientific advancements. Disney Star Wars doesn't feel like Star Wars because it is trying to spread an ideology that isn't relatable to the common values all cultures share. It looks and sounds like Star Wars, but the message isn't. Secondly, the sequel trilogy doesn't feel like a sequel because even though it claims to be the continuation of the Skywalker saga, it doesn't show the last step of the hero's journey shown in the original trilogy. What we should have seen was Luke bettering society and passing along his knowledge to others. Instead, Disney's trilogy is a blatant replacement meant to pass along feminist propaganda instead of completing the good versus evil story. The Star Wars movies put out by Disney instead feel like propaganda that want you to believe that your value as a good person comes from your race, gender, and sexual orientation, and wants you to believe that you are bad if you don't automatically trust or obey women. And you as a Star Wars fan have a very good reason to dislike Disney Star Wars, and that feeling of dislike will never fade, because the Disney Star Wars movies betray the core values that normal people around the world have been taught, the core values that constitute a good person, a heroic person even. If you've been wondering why I haven't put out a video for a while, blame Mahler for his crazy 2.5 hour long introduction video to breaking down The Force Awakens. Some subscribers have been pushing me to make longer videos, and watching Mahler's analysis pushed me into making my own lengthier analysis video. Unfortunately, longer videos take a longer amount of time to prepare for, so I'm sorry. If you have made it this far, thank you for listening. Maybe click that like button, subscribe, and leave a comment below if you thought this video made sense, or if you didn't think it made sense. And
may the Force be with you.